Lately, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of concern about the big social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, which is owned by Google and so forth, imposing either outright bans or so-called shadow bans on conservative and libertarian thinkers, right? Closing their accounts for making politically incorrect remarks, or adjusting the algorithm that these platforms use to display stories in a certain order and so forth, so that people are less likely to see posts from individuals and groups that are thought to be politically suspect. If you do a Google search, even Trump alleges that, right, if you search for Donald Trump on Google, Google has either designed the algorithm in such a way, or there are people explicitly coding it such a way that, Stormy Daniels is the #1 hit or whatever if you search for Donald Trump. Lou Rockwell even mentioned in his remarks yesterday that companies like PayPal have refused to deal with websites and publishers and so forth, who have kind of sort of disreputable ideas. And there's the whole crusade emphasized over the last few months about fake news and how it's the responsibility of Facebook and Twitter and other social media firms to weed out the fake news. Of course, what is fake news? Well, the usual definition of fake news is, news not approved by the state, right, and the established media companies and so forth. So there's a lot of pressure on technology firms to put policies in place that make sure that only sort of approved opinions get out and are seen by people and so forth. Some of you may have seen, it was about 3 weeks ago, I think, I believe it was Breitbart, produced or shared a leaked video of an all-hands meeting at Google a few days after the 2016 election, or the first one of their company-wide meetings that took place after the election, with all of the top executives at Google, including the founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, crying, and people were sort of, singing "We Shall Overcome" and so forth, as people expressed their sorrow and how hurt they were about the election results and so forth. There was one survey of political opinions among Google employees suggesting that those who identified as conservative or libertarian, felt highly uncomfortable sharing their views with their colleagues, as you can imagine. And you remember the incident from 2017 where an engineer at Google named James Damore published an internal memo, I think it was called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, complaining that there was a lack of viewpoint diversity within Google on issues not just related to politics, but on issues such as gender diversity in the workplace, and that it was harmful to Google professionally that there was only sort of one official view that was allowed on these kind of social issues, and that it would be better for the firm, better for creativity and so forth, if there were a little bit more diversity of opinion. Of course, then that memo was outed, and he was abruptly fired by Google, in what was kind of a PR blow for Google, at least among people like us, right? And even when I was looking the other day for checking the date on that, most of the news articles refer to him as, the anti-diversity guy who wrote an anti-diversity screed. I mean, it wasn't an anti-diversity screed. It was actually a pro-diversity argument if we mean diversity of opinion, right? He said, well, maybe we ought to think in other ways about why there are relatively few female engineers in Silicon Valley. Maybe it's something other than the patriarchy. Maybe there are other explanations we should explore, but that is described in the media as an anti-diversity stance. Okay, so how can we explain this? How can an industry that is such a great driver of capitalist growth and progress be staffed by people who have such anti-capitalist views? How can we explain that? Well, I mean, first, keep in mind that if we're talking about the social media companies, right, they maybe are better understood not as technology firms per se, but as media companies. Right now, the New York Times is also a very large private for-profit company. The Washington Post, of course, is owned by Amazon, owned by Jeff Bezos, right? So it's not at all surprising that many large, profitable, for-profit enterprises take a very socialist, left-wing, anti-capitalist stance. I mean, we see that in the traditional media. And this has been, there are many explanations offered over the years. Great social theorists like Joseph Schumpeter and F.A. Hayek have pointed out that when you look at the media, universities, other kind of the publishing industry, and many sort of public intellectuals, the reason that they're so left-wing is not because, smart, articulate people tend to be on the left, but because of a kind of a selection bias that smart and capable people who are kind of uncomfortable with markets and commerce, who like to tell other people what to do, right, tend to select into academia, into journalism, into the media, and so forth, whereas equally smart and capable and articulate people who are comfortable with the world of affairs tend to self-select into business and tend to be pro-capitalism and be in the capitalist sector, where we don't see them as much, right? Because their job is not to stand up in front of people and talk, but rather to make goods and services and to make the world a better place. Of course, when you are in the universities or you're in the journalism industry, it's to your advantage to be friendly toward the state, to support the government. Murray Rothbard, of course, wrote about this on many occasions, this kind of unholy alliance between public intellectuals who provide sort of legitimacy and justification for the state, in exchange for which they get access, they get privilege, they get special protection, they get public funding and subsidies and so forth. So we shouldn't be surprised that, to the extent that Facebook and Twitter and so forth are media companies, that their personnel have the same kind of ideology as other media companies, namely an anti-capitalist kind of a view. And of course, there's also a lot of what we might call confirmation bias among media types, right? They interpret events when they look at what's going on, the hearings in the Senate in the last couple, U.S. Senate in the last couple of days. Hardly anybody in the established media or in these new media companies is, kind of trying to report on the facts of what happened in order to establish some kind of truth or discover the facts of what took place 25 or 30 years ago, right? Everything is interpreted to fit into a preconceived narrative, right? And depending on what your preconception is, you describe these events in a way that reinforces your particular ideology. Okay, but what about tech companies specifically, right? Why are Amazon and Apple and Microsoft and firms like that? Why are their executives and employees? Why do they tend to have this particular ideology? I mean, let's keep in mind that these are private, for-profit companies. Okay, whatever you feel about Twitter or Facebook, I mean, their assets are owned by investors, shareholders. These are private companies. Their business is to make profits by providing goods and services to consumers. And of course, these companies have created tremendous value for human beings, right? For consumers, for humanity in the last few decades. So there's no doubt about that. But of course, we don't live in a pure capitalist economy. We don't live in a free market society. We live in a mixed economy in which many firms can become large and influential, not merely by providing goods and services that people want, but also by kind of cozying up to the state, right? And of course, we know from history. Patrick talked yesterday about his work editing Rothbard's book on the Progressive Era. Right, throughout history, many big business people have not been pro-market, but have been pro-subsidy, pro-privilege, in a way that benefits themselves. So we shouldn't be surprised that large, wealthy, profitable companies can be staffed by people who are not pro-market. And again, I think the social media companies are like media companies in that they don't want to offend the powers that be. A good example is Google, has allegedly is working closely with government officials in China to make sure that Google kind of enables the sort of censorship that is common in China in order to gain access to that market. You might remember the whole thing in big issue in 2016 where the FBI wanted Apple to unlock an iPhone to be able to provide some information about a criminal case. And Apple CEO Tim Cook made a big deal of opposing the FBI on these grounds. That kind of stuff is just a sham, right? That's theater, that's political theater. In reality, the tech companies work very closely with the NSA and the CIA and the FBI and other government and their equivalents around the world to, partner with law enforcement in an appropriate manner to make sure that no one can use their technologies for, inappropriate purposes. Again, as Patrick pointed out, when we look at the progressive era, right, many of the rules and regulations that were allegedly designed to protect consumers and the public from harmful big businesses were really, written by and designed by those big businesses directly in order to protect them against their younger, smaller competitors. I was really struck by a couple of scenes earlier this year when, they had those hearings in the U.S. Congress and they made Mark Zuckerberg appear before Congress and explain what Facebook is doing to get, to keep out the Russian bots and so forth, make sure the Russians don't steal the election for Trump. And at one point, Zuckerberg said, look, there's a real danger in allowing the government to have influence on, information channels. And then just a few moments then he pointed out, and we, Facebook, we're not a small company. We're a large, dominant firm. It's relatively easy for us to work with you, Congress, to meet your rules and restrictions. But it's much harder for smaller, younger companies like we, Facebook, once were. And so Zuckerberg, he's basically stating the thesis that Rothbard emphasized, right, that regulation often helps big businesses at the expense of smaller businesses. So hence big business typically favors regulation that imposes more costs on younger and smaller rivals than on big business itself. And then 10 minutes later in the hearing, he says to another congressperson, we at Facebook would be delighted to work with you in designing the rules that will govern cyberspace, to make sure we get rid of fake news. Well, did nobody pick up on the sort of juxtaposition between those two remarks? Okay, so what does government do to help the technology sector? Why would tech firms have a more favorable opinion of government than they otherwise would? Well, I mean, in some cases it's obvious, right? There's some obvious cases of cronyism. Elon Musk comes to mind, right? So let's put that aside because that one's too obvious. There are more subtle ways in which government intervention helps these companies. There's intellectual property protection, right? So most software products are copyrighted. Other technologies, hardware relies heavily on the patent system. So in a world of a different kind of intellectual property regime, there might be different business models that these firms would need to use, and which might be much more costly for them. There's the internet itself, which the origins of which owes a lot to government intervention, right? The internet evolved out of the so-called ARPANET, which was a Defense Department project from the 1960s and 1970s. I wrote an article in the Free Market many years ago called "Government Did Create the Internet, but the Free Market Made It Glorious," which got a lot of downloads, a lot of hits on Mises.org, arguing that, the government did play a big role in the development of the internet, but that kind of was harmful rather than helpful. The internet might be better today if it had not been for massive government subsidies. So I'm obviously not making a claim like the one associated with the British academic Mariana Mazzucato, who says, well, we really owe the government a big word of thanks for the development of technology, and therefore we need more regulation and more subsidies and so forth. I'm making the opposite claim. The government has had a big impact in helping some technologies and technology companies, but to the detriment of the overall working of the system. But another one piece of intervention that's not talked about very much is a certain part of a 1996 law called the Communications Decency Act, which was sold to the public as a way of protecting, minors from harmful and abusive material online. But there was a little piece called Section 230. Now, the Communications Decency Act itself was struck down by the Supreme Court as being overly broad, but the Section 230 provision remains. It explicitly gives internet firms immunity for any kind of sort of, common law tort action like defamation or libel for material that is published on those platforms. Right. So in other words, if the New York Times publishes an article that is, defamatory towards Tom DiLorenzo, I mean, I know that's shocking to imagine. Tom DiLorenzo could potentially sue. He could sue for defamation. He could sue for libel or whatever. And the argument would be, well, the New York Times is a curated platform. I mean, maybe Patrick Newman wrote the article, but it was published in the New York Times, edited by the New York Times, so the New York Times is legally liable for the content of its publication. But Section 230 says that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so forth are not legally responsible for content that is on their platforms, right? So some people have interpreted this as a kind of a subsidy that allows social media firms it made their business model more viable, allowed them to attract investment and other forms of capital that maybe they wouldn't have been able to attract if investors were concerned that they could be subject to big losses in litigation. And so the argument always was, well, the New York Times is, sort of constructed from the top down. We're just an open platform where anybody can post anything, so you can't hold us responsible for what people post. Well, if that's the case, then those companies cannot now be going through and removing fake news and banning certain authors and so forth. Well, now you're like the New York Times. Now you're curating. You can't simultaneously curate and be immune from responsibility for what is published. But that's what this legislation imposes.